That is no doubt unpleasant to go through a self-examination and an external examination, both within the Pentagon and with Congress, to highlight all the things we did wrong.
All players, low down, active, bullseye, 1327. Post active.
Lights on.
Welcome to The Merge, where we make sense of events in an enjoyable way. I'm Mike Benitez, and joining me for co-hosting duties today is the Honorable Jake Chapman. Today, speaking of honorable, we are joined by Andrew Hunter, the Air Force's senior acquisition official. He's here to talk about how the Air Force is transforming itself for great power competition. This includes all the stuff you can see, the hundreds of hardware and software programs that he oversees, but it's also the things you can't see, which is the processes and organization adjustments that's going to drive innovation, acquisitions, so the Air Force can buy, test, and field the stuff it needs to the warfighter at the speed of need. Mr. Hunter, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Great to be with you.
Your official title is the ATNL, Acquisitions, Technology, and Logistics. And for people who have no idea why there's a civilian that is the senior weapons buyer that does that job, can you talk just a little bit about what is your roles and responsibilities and how you kind of interact as the senior civilian?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a couple of reasons why this is a civilian function. It really starts with the fact that, civilian control of the military. The service secretary, Secretary Kendall, ultimately has the authority. It's his authority under which we acquire material, services, software, all of that stuff for the Air Force. So really, I'm his deputy for that purpose, if you will, and the day-to-day lead for doing acquisition, and it's a service secretary responsibility. And it ties back to the fact that when you're expending the kinds of resources that we spend on military hardware, military software, services, that's fundamental to civilian control of the military.
You oversee, I looked at the numbers, you oversee 550 acquisition programs and $60 billion portfolio. That's not total, that's annual portfolio. How do you manage all of that? That has to be, you must have some kind of management practices, best practices you picked up along the way to be able to coordinate, orchestrate, and stay on top of all of those moving pieces.
Well, I stay up very late. That's the No, it's a great point, right? So you obviously have to focus. You have to focus on the big programs. So I delegate a lot of my responsibility and authority down the chain of command. For acquisition purposes, the chain of command is from me, from my position, the service acquisition executives, to our program executive officers. And we have a little over 20 program executive officers, PEOs, who are they're the real leads. And they organize the work of all of those 550 programs that you've mentioned. There's a subset of them that are so big and so significant to the Air Force that I engage on them directly on a very regular basis. And those are what we used to call them major defense acquisition programs, MDAPs. We now call, now we have multiple pathways, some of which we may get into later, like the middle tier of acquisitions, so-called MTAs. But based on size and significance of a program, I'll focus on it. And it's probably more like 30-ish of those programs that are in that top tier category that I focus on a routine basis.
Yeah, I mean, we don't have time to dig into all of those programs, and I'll tee this up for Jake here in a second. You find yourself in that position, I think, in a very unique time, because it's almost an acquisitions perfect storm. So you have the bow wave of conventional modernization, so new fighters, tankers, command and control, jet trainers, airborne electronic attack. Then you have this even bigger bow wave of nuclear modernizations and 2/3 of the triad, which we might get into. Then you have these new technologies for the force structure, CCAs and hypersonics. Then you put that in a relatively budget constrained environment for various reasons, even though it looks like a lot of money, it's not. And then you combine that with the era of global competition. That seems just like either it's the perfect storm, which is either a really amazing opportunity or a very significant problem. Is that an accurate read?
You've described it very well. And I would say for me, it's just my nature. I think of it as an opportunity, an incredible time to work with the team here. All the PEOs that I mentioned, General White, the chief, the vice chief, the secretary, and all my colleagues to shape the Air Force of the future to win a fight that is harder more complex, potentially at a larger scale than anything that's ever been done before. So I see that as an opportunity. Obviously, it's a pretty sobering responsibility at the same time, but there's a lot of work to be done there, and we've got an incredible team engaged in doing it. And that's, for me, one of the things that I appreciate most, having come into this job. And it's certainly, I've worked with the Air Force for years, but not with the kind of direct engagement intensity that I have the chance to do now. And the team that we have in place has some of the best professionals in this business that I've ever seen.
There's a saying, and I'll tee this up for Jake. There's a saying that if you keep doing what you're doing, you're going to keep going where you're going.
Yeah.
So the Air Force is, internally, I know you're managing a ton of process adjustments, organizational realignments to get after the problem that we talked about. Jake, you probably have some questions about some of that inside baseball, those processes and contracting mechanisms, and how do we incentivize industry to deliver the things at that speed of need, right?
How do you think about cost plus contracting versus firm fixed price? I know a lot of the...
Oh, we're just digging right in.
You teed it up, Mike. But a lot of the primes have come out this year, the larger traditional primes, and have said that they want to take a step back from firm fixed price, and would love to hear your thoughts.
Here's how I think about it. The point is, what are we trying to do? And in general, we're trying to deliver capability, and we're trying to do it fast and at scale. We do that best and most successfully when the government's interest is aligned with the interests of the contractor. And the primary way that we manage and we align interests is through the contract. That's what spells out what the contractor's incentives are. And we on the government side, if we think clearly, understand what our incentives are, and we can align them through the contracting approach that we use. In a lot of cases, fixed price works well for that. When we really clearly understand the task and we know how to do it, and we know that we know how to do it, and we know that the contractor knows how to do it, fixed price works really well. In a lot of cases, especially when you're trying to push the cutting edge, it's a lot less clear than that. And historically, that's where we use cost plus contracting is in order to accommodate for the uncertainties that are inherent in doing something that's never been done before. And so you basically safeguard the contractor from the risk of losing a ton of money trying to do something that's really hard that's never been done before by using a cost plus contracting approach. And we've got a ton of safeguards that we've built in, right, in terms of knowing that we've got solid accounting so the contractor can't just pad the bill. Not that they would ever want to do that.
I'm sure no patriotic American would ever pad the bill.
Exactly.
Yeah, pad the pad.
So I think about contract type as fundamentally what best aligns what the government wants and what we're trying to achieve with what earns the contractor the most money. And we hit the sweet spot when they make the most money, when they give us what we want.
Is that what drove the E-7 Wedgetail contract negotiations? It was over the type of contract, because I know it was a price negotiation, which it doesn't really say in the press what type of contract they're negotiating, but based on how contentious it was over so much time, I'm guessing it's some kind of fixed price, which is why Boeing was trying to negotiate the risk. Is that an accurate read if you could share?
I would say it was mostly about price. And then, of course, what gets rolled into that is being very clear about contract scope. In other words, what work are they actually being required to perform? And what work are we willing to pay for it, right? Because there's things that when you look hard at it, you say, do we really need that? Is that something that we can live without or that we can wait on? So price and scope are the main things. The thing is, when you dig into contract type, it's not as clear cut as you might imagine, because there are versions of cost type contracting that have fixed elements, and there are versions of fixed price contracting that aren't that distinguishable from cost plus. And so it gets more complicated than just fixed versus cost when you dig into it. And also individual contracts usually have different contract line items that have elements of both, right? There's cost elements and there's fixed elements. And so that's why these are very involved negotiations with industry. And I like to go fixed where I can, right? Where we have that degree of knowledge and certainty that I talked about. Then I want as much fixed price in that area as I can. But there are many areas where we have to acknowledge we don't have that. In the case E-7 is a pretty mature platform. It's an existing design, but then there were some modifications to the design that the Air Force has to have to make it viable for us. And so there was also areas where we needed that degree of flexibility in our contract.
Makes sense. Now for that, that's a $2.5 billion handshake deal, as I understand it right now, to keep moving forward for the first two prototypes. But to close that deal, you actually had to phone a friend, which Shay Assad, who was famous for being branded with a headline as the most hated man in the Pentagon about 15 years ago in some press. So he's one of the top tier negotiators, and so they tap the bullpen, have him come out. So how did those dynamics play out? Where I understand that we're trying to modernize only the force, but also our acquisitions, expertise, and experience, and grow the force from within and experts. But you had to phone a friend for Shay Assad, which is obviously like top tier. How did that play out, and what kind of lessons learned are you taking back as far as like developing your own workforce to do things like that in the future?
Yeah, well, I'm glad you mentioned the workforce, right? Because, I use the phrase in another venue that, it's like having the Bill Belichick of contracting on your team.
That's a really loaded phrase, depending on what city you're from and how you feel about Bill Belichick.
Yeah, depending on where you're from. It's a good thing, or he might be the most hated man in the Pentagon. You're not a Patriots fan.
But part of the idea there is it's the coach role, right? So Bill Belichick doesn't go on the field and play, but he sets the players up for success. And so what Shay was really able to do is to come in, talk to our contracting team. He did also engage with the contract team. There was some coaching there as well to set everyone up for success. And then ultimately, the contracting officer or the contracting team did the core negotiation. But sometimes, you need that trick play that matches the situation. And Shay has the biggest playbook around because he's seen it all. So that helps us, solve those hard problems where you do say, hey, there's an element of risk here that the contractor wants to make sure, they're not left holding the bag on. The government, can't bear unmitigated risk on our part. So what are the tools and mechanisms we can put in the contract that gets both sides to where they need to be? And Shay has a lot of insight into how to solve some of those problems because he's done it before.
In case people are listening and waiting for us to talk about NGAD or F-35, we're not going to talk about either one. We talked about this off camera. There's two reasons why. Mr. Hunter doesn't oversee the F-35 program. That's a joint program. And then NGAD, the Secretary of the Air Force, has that talking stick. So we're not going to talk about those two, but there are a couple others I want to talk to, and then I want to kind of go back into the weeds of acquisition innovation and some of the contract structures. Speaking of that, B-21, 100 stealth bombers, hopefully more, something like $200 billion over the next 30 years. That's one of the success stories. It's pretty much on schedule, and it sounds like mostly a success, even they had some technical issues to work through. Can you talk a little bit about that? I know you have a connection to the RCOs. You sit on that board. Most people may not be familiar with, but how does a program that big, run by a program office that small, be so successful? And I understand they don't have anything special authorities-wise. They're just structured differently.
They are structured differently. One of the big differences, they report directly to me. And as you say, we have a board that manages the RCO, which includes the Secretary of the Air Force, the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition Sustainment. So they have a direct and strong tie to senior leadership, and that's essentially why they were chosen to be the lead for the B-21 program, because we wanted to be very disciplined and stay true to the promises that had been made to the Secretary of Defense at the time, Bob Gates, who approved the program, that we were actually going to deliver what we had persuaded. I say we, I wasn't personally in the seat at the time, but that the organization had persuaded the Secretary of Defense to support, and that we were going to be disciplined in implementation, meet those cost targets, meet the schedule, so that what we were going to be delivering was what he had agreed to. So there's huge discipline in that approach. One thing that developed over time that maybe wasn't fully foreseen when we went into it is we took a relatively small seat conservative approach to doing cost estimation on the B-21. Again, we wanted that realism to persuade the Secretary of Defense that we weren't just selling him a bill of goods. So we took a pretty small seat conservative approach to budgeting and cost estimation. What that meant was in the early years, they actually had money available that was not directly contractually required in the early years. So we were able to use that fund, those funds, to do what we call active management. That is to anticipate risk in the program and start to put investment funds against reducing that risk, through testing, through building more sophisticated digital models, through testing things out in the real world early, before you had, an aircraft off the line. And that has been a huge help. And I think it's been a big key to the B-21 success. By the way, from a personnel perspective, right, because you mentioned that the RCO team is small, and it is, but they're also leveraging the rest of the Air Force acquisition enterprise at the same time. So we have additional folks with huge expertise, Air Force Material Command, who have been supporting the program office at the RCO. And that's been a great arrangement and one of the real best practices as well.
It's interesting you mentioned that kind of extra pot of money, basically to manage risk, actively manage risk, essentially. In industry, I see a lot of programs internally when companies have government contracts, they often set up a management reserve based on the complexity and uncertainty. And so it's a 10 or 20% kind of set aside, whether that's engineering talent or maybe some resources in another manner that they need to shift as, pull from the bullpen. It's kind of their piggy bank, but it's baked into how they structure the program so they can manage that risk instead of reacting to it. One of the things about the B-21 I think was interesting, and you can correct me 100% here, Jake. You might be full thread on this for contracts. It has a hybrid contract structure, if I remember right. So it's a cost plus development, but then a fixed price production, and the fixed price production was based on a number from like 2010 or 2012 when they kind of baselined the program, obviously adjusted for inflation. That kind of set the constraints of the technology is you control the production cost, and then you go back and go, okay, cost plus to develop the thing to meet the cost target. Did I say that right?
I'd say, yeah, that's pretty close. The EMD contract, EMD is that development contract that you referenced, is cost plus. It doesn't mean that it's unconstrained on cost because we're constrained by budget, and if we had gotten off track, we would have had to stop and reevaluate, and we did not. We have very much stayed on track according to that original cost estimate that was done in the mid-2010s at the Milestone B decision point. And then the initial lots of several lots of production were bid by Northrop Grumman as part of the competitive process at fixed prices. So they are contractually obligated to deliver to those prices, and they are then incentivized to control cost to make sure that they don't lose money in that. So that is, as you say, a hybrid model. We're not doing as you said, the development of the aircraft is not at a fixed price. I think one of the concerns industry has had is they had to bid those fixed prices on the aircraft in advance of actually down the detailed design, right? So
that seems like exactly the wrong thing you want to do, which is like what Jake was saying before. It's like, hey, fixed price on production is kind of really unknown with the risk.
So we typically do fixed price in production, but you usually agree on what that fixed price is going to be at a later stage, or we have historically done it.
Yeah, post-design. If you have a known quantity. Yeah.
So that's really been the thing that industry has been coming back and saying the risk here is larger than is typical in defense acquisition.
Earlier, you talked about the fixed price. We'll set the B-21 program aside and kind of zoom way back out. And you said the fixed price, you like to be informed. And so like how I would imagine that industry plays a massive role in informing the acquisitions approach of basically showing that I have this commercial technology. It's actually very mature, and fixed price is what you want to do. My question is, like, how does that industry relationship kind of feed into those decisions? And Jake, you may actually have some more insights for that.
My big question about firm fixed price, separate from cost plus, so put cost plus aside for a second, is should the government care about the vendor's margins in a firm fixed price contract, or should the government only care about cost and capability?
I would say in the short term, we really care about getting what we want. And if the contractor makes a lot of money, that is okay if we're getting what we want. In the longer term, right, it's not sustainable for us to pay more than we should over time. So for example, if we're doing a contract with industry in a fixed price basis in a series of lots, and in the initial lots, we mostly care about getting what we want at a price we can afford. And industry does that very effectively and they make money. That's great. Over time, though, we want to make sure we're paying what we should. And so not to say that we necessarily overpaid early on, but we certainly don't want to overpay in the later, in the middle of the later stages. So it's an evolution to my mind. And it's one reason why we negotiate usually in lots or in blocks rather than for an entire program all at one time.
And it's a little bit semantic. So you're talking about price, but really it's about cost margin versus value, right? Like if the value proposition, so you're trying to quantify something that's subjective with objective information at some point, right? Like you don't determine the price of an iPhone based on the bill of materials or whatever. It's based on the value. Because you have commercial technology, which is obviously like getting, bigger every day, that market. And then you have the kind of the traditional defense industrial suppliers that kind of operate in a different paradigm. How do you kind of hold both of those at the same time?
I'm glad you asked that. Great question. The answer is competition. Over time, this question of, hey, we're getting what we want at a price we can afford. Why do we care what the contractor makes? Because we want to keep the contractor hungry. We want to keep the contractor working hard to continue to drive down cost. And again, we don't want to overpay. And so our best mechanism for balancing those things out is competition, right? Saying, hey, another company can come along, and if you are overcharging, they will offer us what we need at a lower price, and we will go with somebody else. So competition is our primary tool, ensuring that over time, we are getting the value that we deserve and that we need and that the taxpayer expects with the defense dollar. Now, as you are both very familiar with, right, we don't have competition everywhere we might want it. And so we have to have other tools in addition. But competition is the tool number one for that reason.
Yeah, I think there's a sliding scale. There's a lot of programs. It's, how good you can write a paper and have a quad slide PowerPoint, and you're awarding $1 million contracts off of your ability to write something. Then there's I think, demonstration, like show me at least a prototype of something, to like show me it's real and not just PowerPoint and vaporware. And then at the other end, you have this continual competition, which the competition never ends. You're in a consortium and you're just kind of Hunger Games, if you will, which is driving, I would imagine, accelerating the tech and driving value to the warfighter. But I guess my question is, there's obviously a sliding spectrum there. If the competition never ends, there is something to be said by long investments, like long lead time things that you're doing as a company to build a better product where you might not know in 6 months if you're even on the contract. And so how do you hold both of those to be true? How can we incentivize the industry to continue to invest, to improve different tech sectors, but also know that there's no long capture return on investment? It's really arbitrary. And obviously a lot of those companies are raising money from investors, but we're also looking for strong signals from the market, in this case, the Pentagon. How do you think of that?
I think of it in terms of how you structure the market. So let me just give you a couple of notional examples. You can drive a lot of competition at the micro level, right? And individual programs for individual widgets, in the case of the Air Force often, right? Individual aircraft. And so I might get good pricing in the short term on my individual aircraft because I'm driving lots of competition there. But over the long term, I may not be getting all the value I need because I've got industry so focused on cutting costs, that they're not making the investments necessary to drive the advanced capabilities that I need. So that's one way of doing it, right? The other way is highly incentivizing industry to invest in advanced capabilities, maybe giving them longer term contracts and in fewer numbers of competitions over time, but for individual discrete things. And that'll structure the market another way. But then the failure mode there potentially is I'm always paying for that future development, some of which may not pan out or I may not need, right? When I actually get to the future, I may find I didn't invest on the right thing. I need something else that I now need to go make a crash development effort. And the thing I paid all that money to develop isn't really that helpful because the world has moved on. And that's also a risk. So you got to find that sweet spot. And to my mind, it's how you structure the market. It's how we actually go to industry. So here's an example, right? In the mission system space, which is we had structured the market in a way that really incentivized mission systems providers to sell to us through primes. And then the primes were all about winning the competition on the individual platform, which didn't necessarily drive the kind of investment we needed in mission systems long term to get those mission systems where we need them to be to provide the capabilities that they need, because that didn't make a difference. It wasn't make or break on winning any of those individual platform contracts. So we've started going direct to the mission system providers to say, hey, this is the future capability we need in the electronic warfare space, in the sensing space, right? Radars and other kinds of sensors. And we want you to work with us to get there. And yeah, we'll buy the production of those things through, in many cases, through platform contracts. But we're going to work directly with the mission systems providers to move the technology where it needs to go. So we can get good pricing on the platforms by working through a more traditional approach, if you will, but that direct approach to the mission system providers lets us incentivize them long term to go where we need them to go.
That only works because you move to a modular systems where you can go directly to that payload provider and they have an interface that you can basically plug and play. So your switching costs essentially go down, which is what you're driving competition for. Before, like F-35, you can't just plug and play a box. It has to go through the prime, and the prime is the lead systems integrator, and they have their own interfaces that they manage in their own supply base. Is that a key part of like innovation acquisitions, is having that minimize switching costs to continue to have competition in those different markets and consortiums?
That is a key part. Absolutely. You've got that. You've got that right. In addition, we still need to integrate. We still need these different mission systems to be able to work together. And so by going directly to the individual companies, there is an integration challenge, which in the past we relied on the primes to solve for us. And, we can argue about how good they were at that over time. But they did that.
We're all friends here.
But they did that job for us at times well. And now it's a case of the government having to do a lot of that work itself, right? Because we're going directly to the mission systems providers. So what that means is the government, we have to be really good at what we do. We have to understand and know the integration challenge as well as the companies do in order to successfully execute this model of going direct to the mission systems providers. And we do that through the development of these government reference architectures, which you probably hear talked about, bandied about. That's why we're doing that, right? So it helps, they're open systems approaches. It does help lower switching costs. We still have to solve the integration challenge. And so that government reference architecture helps us solve both of those problems. And by the way, when I say government reference architecture, it's because we control and manage the architecture, but we have to work with industry to help build it, right? Because they still have a lot of that technical expertise that only they have, that we have to be successful. So we work with industry, often through consortia, as you mentioned earlier, in order to build those government reference architectures. And that is another fundamental tenet of how we succeed with this approach.
As you take on more of the systems integration role, does that impact the way you think about workforce development in the Air Force?
It does. We have to have as much or more systems engineering expertise as the contractors do. So we have to develop that organically, or we have to hire people who work directly for us to help provide that expertise. And actually, this is, as you find when you dig into this stuff, every problem is an old problem. We created FFRDCs in the past, right? MITRE, aerospace, a lot of these FFRDCs that we think of in their current instantiations, they really started because they were the systems engineering houses that the government relied upon to be independent experts to inform the government. In the case of aerospace for space, right? In the case of MITRE for integration challenges. And they still do that, and we need more of that as well.
Can we go back to the B-21 real quick? It sounds like you had an accidental learning, which is that if you have a little bit more money up front than you were planning on needing, you can use that money to save a lot more money down the road, which is a great insight. Also sounds like a very challenging thing to implement going forward because everyone's trying to keep budgets lean. So have you tried to apply that lesson elsewhere, and have you run into pushback because it's hard to maybe argue for just an extra pot of money up front?
Yeah, great point. And why was it possible to B-21? It was possible because we were making commitments directly to the Secretary of Defense on the B-21 program, which is fairly unique, right? And typically, Secretaries of Defense don't get engaged on individual acquisition programs, and they don't stay with them, even if they do, dip in for a moment. In the case of Bob Gates and B-21, or what became B-21, he did. And he wrote it down, right? It was written direction about how we were to execute the program. And everyone had to live up to that. So, but it's not totally unique, right? We can certainly apply elements of that to other programs. It is my hope that on Sentinel, as we get into the restructuring, which we're currently undertaking, that we can instill some of that B-21 type discipline and accountability into B-21 as well. And it may be the case that allow us to do, and I would like to leverage active management for the Sentinel program as well. But really the key is you've got to have those senior level attention on those programs, right? So we can't do it on the whole 550, that you mentioned at the front end. but we can do it on the things that are critical priorities. And I certainly put Sentinel in that bucket.
I'm going to liven the mood a little bit. Sentinel. Let's talk about it for like 5 minutes because we could talk a whole show about it. We don't have enough time. How painful is the Nunn-Mccurdy Breach?
Yeah, painful is not a bad word. That is no doubt unpleasant to go through a self-examination and an external examination, both within the Pentagon and with Congress, to highlight all the things we did wrong. But ultimately, it's hugely beneficial because we have an opportunity to go fix those things. It's going to cost us time. It has cost us time. It's going to cost us money, which has an impact on budgets going forward. But again, I'm a glass half full kind of person. We're getting after them. We're fixing the things that we got wrong. And that's encouraging. As the person who's responsible under Dr. LaPlante, but responsible for the success of the program, it is really encouraging to see that we can go fix those problems. The ones we look at that we recognize, we're going to go fix them.
You lived it, not me. But from the outsider, it seemed like the biggest concern was, it is by far, in many aspects, the largest acquisitions program in the history of the Air Force. It's the scale of this project is monumental. It's not just the 450 missile silos. It's the 7,500 miles of cabling, the 600 facilities, all that. It's a lot of stuff. I think the cost estimate's like $140 billion. And right now, that the way that contract was initially structured, it went to a prime. Is that one of the lessons you've learned? Like, hey, this is actually too big for any one company to manage, and now we need to break this program apart into different things where we can actually get down to subsystems and things where you have specialized parts of industry. And I would imagine the more narrow those little subcontracts may be, again, I'm just kind of pontificating here for a second, that kind of opens the door to bring in commercial technology and leverage basically the entire American industrial base and not just the defense industrial base, right?
Well, we need a ton of expertise. You're right about that. If you look at the contractor team that there is today, you've got companies on it that are commercial companies and do commercial business. I mean, Bechtel's an example of that, but there are many other.
Well, that's why I'm the outsider and you're the insider.
So we have to solve for that, right? We want people who have expertise in the task, doing the task. And in some cases, when it comes to construction and massive construction projects, traditional defense companies, that is not always their expertise. At the same time, I mentioned the integration challenge earlier, right? Sentinel has to be integrated. The ground system has to work well and be completely complementary to the missile. So we need that design integration across the entire system. And at the same time, we need people who are really good at construction doing construction. We need people who are really good at laying fiber optic cable. And they are the best in the world at doing that. So that does get back to that acquisition strategy, which, you asked earlier, like what's my role? I'm the one who kind of defines and sets the acquisition strategy. In the case of Sentinel, with Dr. LaPlante as the final approval authority for that. And it's that strategy, again, about how do we go to industry so that we get the best in the world at those tasks on the team, doing those tasks for us. So, I think we have a lot of the right ingredients in place with Sentinel, but I think we're going to reevaluate, and we have to reevaluate the acquisition strategy to make sure that we are building the best team to do all those things.
There's a new authority that Congress granted the Pentagon called Quickstart. And it's only probably 6 months old, 6 to 9 months old. But the Air Force, the Space Force in particular, has already picked that up and run with it. And I know Secretary Kendall was the one that was advocating for it. Can you just talk a little bit about why that is such a big win?
Well, it's such a big win because it lets us get going, right? So often in acquisition, the hardest part is getting started. Now, that's not all bad, right? You want to understand what you're doing before you commit hundreds of billions of dollars. But the challenge is it's better to understand what you're doing if you can get started and learn a little first. So this actually ties back to our discussion about, you talked about industry giving us PowerPoint slides and the winner of a competition being determined by who can write the best proposal, vice who maybe does the best work. Well, there's a solution to that. And the solution is we actually get to work with industry on the front end and see their early design work before we commit to the entire enchilada, right? The whole program, the production, the detailed design and all that. So being able to get started quickly and to get into a relationship with industry. And by the way, that's usually the hard part of getting an acquisition project going, is getting approval to let that initial contract. That's where all the bureaucratic pieces come in on the front end. And that's what Quickstart lets us do, is to get into a relationship with industry early on. Then we can actually see their work, right? Not just have them write us a beautiful piece of paper, but see their actual engineering. And then when we get to the point of picking a real winner, we're doing it on the basis of real engineering, not on the basis of PowerPoint. And that's a key thing. That's a key thing of how we've been successful to date so far in our collaborative combat aircraft program, is that we were watching them design as we were deciding who we were going to pick to be our leads for the collaborative combat aircraft program. And Quickstart lets us do that early on for the programs that we're pursuing it. So as you mentioned, we've put forward 2 for the Department of the Air Force, one that I manage on moving target indication at scale, and one on the Space Force side on alternative GPS.
That you mentioned CCAs real quick. What you just described about watching the engineering design process as you're making your decisions to inform your decisions, I think that speaks very highly of General Atomics and Anduril having secured those 2 spots as they continue down that path in competition. So, do you think that those emerging tech companies like Anduril or Shield AI winning a big program of record, whether it's hardware or software, do you think they have to transition to be a quote like a traditional prime that's going to inherit all of those business systems requirements and all of the overhead that kind of like all the primes have devolved into this cost plus monolithic organization because of those systems? Or is there a way to kind of keep them hungry and lean but still grow into the market?
Well, there are things that they're going to have to learn how to do that they haven't necessarily had to do in the past. And I want them to learn how to do those things. I don't want them to learn how to do anything I don't need them to learn how to do, right? So they may or may or not have to learn all the traditional elements of defense contracting in order to succeed. I do need them to be able to do some of the engineering work that has to be done, whether that's airworthiness or other kinds of safety reviews. Yeah, there's going to have to be some of that they're going to have to learn how to do. They're going to have to learn it in a particular context, right? These are uncrewed platforms, so it doesn't have to have all the elements that we might have done traditionally for fighters because there's a pilot in the cockpit, because there isn't. So I want them to learn how to do the things that they need to learn how to do to succeed. I don't want them to necessarily just automatically assume all the baggage of the way we've done it in the past. And I think right now we're on a pretty good path for that. And of course, General Atomic has been building uncrewed aircraft for quite some time and with success.
So Elon Musk, he has a protocol which is delete processes and requirements until you get to the point like, okay, we actually need to add that one back. Basically strip down as much as you can in the sake of efficiency to drive effectiveness. And through flight tests, SpaceX amazingly crashed a ton of rockets, and people used to laugh at them, and now they're in awe at them because they did the whole thing for 30% of the price or 50% of the price that I think the government or NASA thought they could. The DoD tends to take the exact opposite approach. So where do you land on that? Because yes, I think the non-traditionals have to grow up, and there's certain things they have to do. But I think the fault that they have to do all of the things that the primes have to do is maybe a little too binary. It's probably some nuance there. Where do you land?
Well, I think it would be hard for the Department of Defense to go full Elon and just start, ripping things out that,
It's time for anyone to go full Elon.
I'll rip it out and find out.
Never go full Elon. Isn't that the...
Never go full Elon.
That might be hard. That might be hard for multiple reasons for us. But having said that, I think we do have to, critically examine and question ourselves and constantly question ourselves. Does this process add value? Is this design effort needed? Is this subsystem needed, right? We've required it in the past. It's in the spec. Everyone will just do it by default. Well, no, we really have to go back and look. Hey, here's an interesting test case when you look at collaborative combat aircraft. You'd be shocked at how hard landing gear is and how often it causes problems, right? It's just very hard to do. So, obviously both vendors have to have landing gear on their platforms. And one of the vendors is designing their own. That's going to be a really interesting thing to see how they succeed at that. We are not going to dictate to them how they do that, right? They're going to figure it out and they're going to succeed or fail. And it's probably a key benchmark for success of how they succeed or fail at that. And we're going to see how it works, right? We're not going to tell them how to do it. So one of the things that I think Elon does that's really good that I think is being modeled in CCA is the idea of test early, test often. So on that landing gear example, right? Test early, test often. Maybe they'll break 1,000 landing gears before they get the design exactly right. But if they do that, and if they get it right, that's probably going to be a really good landing gear. That might be better than what we would have generated using a traditional defense process, which would not be as aggressive in their approach to that. So that's going to be something I'm going to be watching for sure.
So, what keeps you up at night, and what should be keeping our adversaries up at night?
That's a good one.
Well, what keeps me up at night is just the challenge of the pace at which we have to operate to be successful. Because the strategy describes a pacing challenge. And what I always say when I give speeches and what I say to the team is the pacing challenge is incredibly fast. So it is a challenge, and we have to continually challenge ourselves to keep up with that pace. That's what we're doing. That's why we've approached our collaborative combat aircraft in the way that we've done it, where we have prioritized speed to ramp. And we have moved from, kind of initiation of the idea of going and doing a collaborative combat aircraft to being on contract with vendors who are bending metal in 2 years, which, is not the Pentagon standard. That's what keeps me up at night. So I have to do that there, but I have to do it in as many places as I can to be be
550 programs.
Yeah,
Many
turns
as I
out 550 things keeping you up at night. That's all the time we have. The Honorable Andrew Hunter, the Senior Acquisition Official for the Air Force. Thanks for fencing off some time to chat with us about what you guys are doing to help the Air Force transform itself for a great power competition.
Happy to do it. Thank you very much.
All right, well, that's the show.